Vivid verses.
I've always believed that how a person treats a waiter tells you more about their character than any conversation ever could. It's the small moments, the unguarded ones, that reveal the architecture beneath the surface. I was having lunch at Solara, a mid-range bistro on Cranwell Avenue that made the best pan-seared salmon in the city, when I noticed Petra Voss for the first time. She was 2 tables over, arguing quietly but firmly with a colleague about quarterly projections, a leather portfolio open in front of her, pen tapping the table with controlled impatience. The waiter came to take her order, and she looked up, smiled without condescension, said please and thank you with the kind of naturalness that indicated habit rather than performance. I noted that, filed it away. We were introduced 3 weeks later at a product launch for Crestline Audio, a mid-sized equipment company whose founder, Tom Ashby, had been a university friend of mine. Tom threw small events. 40 people, maximum, good food, better conversation. And he had a talent for mixing professionals from different industries in ways that sparked genuine dialogue. Petra worked in architectural design. I ran my own software consultancy, Veritas Systems, which I had built from a 2-man operation in a shared office space on Holmwood Drive into a 12-person firm with a client list that included 2 publicly traded companies. I was 34. I had worked hard, slept adequately, and earned what I had. Tom introduced us over glasses of Pellegrino. Petra was sharp, direct, and funny in a dry, observational way that I appreciated. We talked for 40 minutes without either of us glancing toward the rest of the room. She had opinions about structural minimalism that were well-reasoned and defensible. I pushed back on 2 of her points, and she engaged with my disagreement rather than deflecting it. That told me something too. I asked for a number before the evening ended. She gave it without hesitation. We dated for 7 months. Those 7 months were largely good. I want to be clear about that, because what came later did not erase what preceded it, even if it recontextualized everything. We ate at small restaurants on weeknights and cooked at each other's apartments on weekends. She introduced me to architectural walking tours of the city, pointing out details and facades I had walked past 100 times without registering. I showed her the mechanics of how software systems fail, the elegant disasters, the cascading errors, and she found it genuinely interesting rather than politely tolerant. Her friends were a mixed group. Some I liked. A few I found performative in ways I found mildly tedious but ultimately irrelevant. Her closest friend was a woman named Cassidy Holt, who worked in event coordination and talked at a speed and volume that suggested she had never learned the value of a pause. Cassidy was not malicious, as far as I could tell. She was simply a person who had never developed a strong filter between thought and speech. This quality, I would later understand, was going to be significant. Petra's behavior toward me was warm, but as the months progressed, occasionally pointed in a direction I didn't fully examine until I stepped back and looked at the pattern rather than individual incidents. She would rephrase things I said in social situations, smoothing out what she called my directness without my asking. She suggested once that I soften my tone in emails to a mutual contact, even though my email had been professional and factually accurate. When I made a decision about a weekend trip without consulting her first, a solo hiking weekend I had planned 6 weeks in advance, she expressed a disappointment that felt disproportionate to the situation, framed as concern for our communication rather than what it was, an expectation of veto power over my independent schedule. Each incident, isolated, was small. I addressed each one calmly as it came. I did not raise my voice. I did not negotiate my boundaries under pressure. I stated my position, listened to hers, and maintained my footing without cruelty. She would back down, and for a period afterward things would be easy again. But patterns don't lie. Individual events can be explained. Patterns reveal intent. I was aware, during those 7 months, that something in the dynamic was being nudged. Carefully, incrementally. I am not a man who arrives at conclusions emotionally. I gather observations, hold them, and wait for the weight of evidence to tip toward clarity. By month 6, the weight was accumulating. The incident that ended things happened on a Tuesday evening in early November. We were at a dinner with 2 of her colleagues from the Callaway Design Group. A casual dinner, 6 people at Orvino, a wine bar on the corner of Pemberton Street that did small plates. I had been describing a negotiation with a difficult client, one that had required a level of strategic patience I was proud of. Petra laughed lightly and said, to the table, "He always makes it sound more complicated than it was. You should hear the simple version." The table laughed. I did not. I looked at her. She registered my expression and moved the conversation forward, but the damage was done. Not because she had embarrassed me. I am not easily embarrassed, but because she had done it casually in a way that suggested she had done it before or intended to do it again. It was a small act of public diminishment dressed up as playful familiarity. On the way home in the car, I said, calmly and without rehearsal, "Don't do that again." She said she was just joking. I said I understood that, and that I was not interested in being the subject of jokes at my own expense in front of people I barely knew. I was not asking her to understand my perspective. I was telling her that it would not happen again. She said I was being oversensitive. There it was, the reframe. The classic move of converting a legitimate grievance into a character flaw of the person raising it. I had seen this pattern before, not from her specifically, but from people who had never fully accepted that others had the right to define their own limits. "No," I said, "I'm not, and I think we've reached the end of the road." She went quiet for a long moment. Then she asked if I was serious. "Yes," I said. The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours. She was not pleased. She cycled through several approaches: reasonable discussion, emotional appeal, a brief pivot to my apparent flaws, and then back to something resembling sincerity. I engaged where engagement was useful and held my position throughout. I did not waver because I was not operating from anger. I had arrived at a decision from evidence and reasoning, and decisions made that way don't tend to collapse under emotional pressure. We ended it that night. She left my apartment at 11:30, and I made tea and sat at my kitchen table for a while, not in distress, but in the particular quiet that follows the resolution of a long-held tension. I slept well. The 3 weeks that followed were uneventful by design. I focused on a system migration project for a logistics company called Northport Holdings, put in long hours, went running in the mornings along the riverside path that traced the edge of Callum Park, and had dinner with a couple of friends on a Friday night at Brackford Grill. I did not contact Petra. She sent 2 messages in the first week, one asking to talk, one that was more philosophical in tone about the nature of what we had shared. I read both. I did not respond to either. There was nothing to add to what had already been said. I want to be precise about my emotional state during this period. I was not bitter. I had cared about Petra genuinely, in the way I care about people who earn that care through sustained, authentic behavior. Whatever her intentions had been, and I had not yet fully understood them, the better parts of our time together had been real to me. I carried no hostility. What I did carry was clarity. The party where everything unraveled was on a Saturday, 3.5 weeks after the breakup. It was hosted by a colleague of mine, Patrick Osei, a data architect who lived in a refurbished townhouse in the Fernwick district, and through irregular Saturday gatherings that were half dinner party, half informal industry discussion. Usually 15 to 20 people. Good wine, no dress code, the kind of environment where you could talk substantively without performance. I had known Patrick would likely have invited some overlapping social contacts. The city's professional circles folded back on themselves. I had not anticipated Petra would be there, but when I saw her in the kitchen talking to someone near the island counter, I registered it, recalibrated, and continued into the room. I spoke to Patrick, got a drink, sparkling water. I had an early meeting Sunday, and found my way into a conversation about urban infrastructure with a structural engineer named Vance Whitmore. Petra and I exchanged a brief, civil nod across the room at some point. Nothing more. I had no interest in manufactured awkwardness, and evidently neither did she. What I had not noticed until about 90 minutes into the evening was that Cassidy Holt was also there. She was across the room near the bookshelf, holding what was clearly not her first drink of the evening. Her voice had reached a volume that meant the conversations around her had gradually contracted, as people tend to do when a nearby energy source becomes too intense. I noted her. She was talking to a woman I didn't recognize. I returned to my conversation. 20 minutes later, Patrick's partner called everyone to the dining area for food. A spread of shared plates, lamb kofta, roasted vegetables, 3 kinds of bread, and the gathering reorganized itself around the long table. I ended up seated between Vance and a graphic designer named Theo Brandt, who had interesting opinions about visual systems. Cassidy sat 4 seats down, still animated, still a volume. I was not paying particular attention to her conversation. I was talking to Theo about the perceptual psychology of user interface design, which was genuinely engaging. But I have a trained ear for pattern disruption, and at some point in the ambient noise of the room, I heard my own name. Not spoken to me, spoken about me, in the register of someone who has crossed the threshold where self-monitoring stops working. Honestly, the whole thing started as a dare. Basically, not a dare exactly, but I did not react. I did not turn my head. I continued my conversation with Theo while redirecting approximately 40% of my attention 4 seats down the table. Slow down. Listen. Don't signal. She never actually thought it would go anywhere. That's the thing. Like, the whole point was, can she actually? And he's so... A quieter voice interjected something I couldn't catch. No, I know, and that's what's so, because it actually became real for her, which none of us expected. But the way it started was literally a bet, like Petra and Gemma had this whole. Could she land and keep someone who was, the exact phrase was, out of her league? And also, like, could she actually... The quieter voice said something sharp. Cassidy made a sound of mild, drunk protest. I'm not saying anything bad. I'm just saying it became real. That's actually the nice part of the story. I took a slow breath through my nose. There it is. Not anger. Not devastation. Something considerably colder and more precise. The sensation of a hypothesis I hadn't consciously formed being proven correct by evidence I had not sought. I have a particular quality of mind that I neither take credit for nor apologize for. I do not lie to myself. I do not dress uncomfortable truths in comfortable clothing. When reality presents itself plainly, I receive it plainly. The reality presenting itself, for seats away, through the undisciplined mouth of a woman who had had 3 glasses too many, was this. The relationship I had spent 7 months and had begun as a social experiment. A bet. A demonstration project. Can she land and control someone out of her league? I turned this over in my mind with the methodical attention I would give any system I was trying to understand. The initial approach, warm, interested, well calibrated, genuine or designed. Probably both. People who run these kinds of social operations still use real tools. The early months, authentic connection, because Petra was genuinely intelligent and the compatibility was real. But compatibility being real does not mean the context in which it developed was honest. The incremental shaping, the rephrasing, the email, the weekend trip, the dinner table, a pattern of small adjustments, each individually deniable, cumulatively directional. Not the behavior of someone simply used to getting their way. The behavior of someone running a program. The fact that it became real for her. Cassidy said that. The nice part of the story, she called it. Irrelevant to the founding architecture. A house built on sand does not become structurally sound because the family that eventually lives in it comes to love it. I resumed my full attention on Theo, who was making a point about cognitive load in navigation design. I agreed with part of it and pushed back constructively on another. I ate my dinner. I answered Patrick's question about the Northport migration from across the table. I did all of this without agitation, but I was building something internally, quietly, precisely. The evening wound down gradually, as Patrick's gatherings tended to. People drifted toward the living room. Conversations broke apart and reformed. I spent time talking with Patrick himself near the window, the city's light visible through the glass, and we discussed a collaborative project he was considering that might have a role for Veritas. Petra had spent most of the second half of the evening near the far end of the room, talking to a couple I didn't know. She was aware of my presence in the room. I had registered that, but maintaining a careful, reasonable distance. Whatever she was feeling, she was managing it with dignity. I respected the effort even now. Cassidy had quieted considerably. Post-alcohol, the volume had dropped, and she was seated on the couch looking at her phone with the particular vacant energy of someone who was going to feel regretful in the morning but not yet fully understand why. I found my way to Petra at roughly 9:40. The couple she had been talking to had moved toward the kitchen. She was standing near the window seat with a glass of red wine, and she looked up when I approached without surprise. She had known this was likely at some point in the evening. "Hi," she said. "Hi," I said. "Can we step out for a minute?" She read my tone. Her expression shifted subtly. Not alarm exactly, but recognition. "Sure," she said. Patrick had a narrow back terrace off the kitchen, a strip of decking with 2 chairs and a gas heater that was running, making the space warm enough despite the November air. We stepped out, and the door closed behind us, muting the conversation inside. I did not waste time. "I want to ask you something directly," I said, "and I'd like a direct answer. How did we meet? I don't mean the logistics of Tom's event. I mean what preceded that. What was the context?" She was quiet for a moment. Her jaw shifted slightly. She's deciding whether to play it as confusion. I watched her choose not to. "What did you hear?" she asked. "That's not a direct answer," I said. Another pause. Longer. The heater hummed. Somewhere inside, someone laughed at something. "It started as something stupid," she said. "Something that it was a long time ago. It was before I knew you, and a bet," I said. The words sat between us. She looked down at her glass. "It wasn't," she stopped. Restarted. "Gemma and I had this conversation when we both had too much to drink, and she had this whole thing about how I would never actually be able to sustain something with someone she stopped again. It was juvenile. It was honestly juvenile and stupid, and by the time I actually met you properly and talked to you, none of that was still the frame," I said. She was quiet. "Here's what I'd like you to understand," I said, and my voice was even, not cold exactly, but stripped of warmth. The way a room sounds when the furniture has been moved out. I'm not standing here in a rage. I don't feel rage about this. What I feel is a specific kind of clarity. She looked up. Her eyes were wet. Not crying yet, but close. "You came into this with a predetermined objective," I said. "You wanted to know if you could land someone you'd been told was out of your reach, and then control the dynamic. You spent 7 months, and I've watched this. I want you to know I've watched this, incrementally testing the edges of what I'd accept. The rephrasing, the email, the schedule management, the dinner table. I'm not asking you to confess," I said. "I'm telling you what I observed. Whether it was a conscious program or something that had become habituated, the pattern was there. And now I understand the origin story. It became real. Her voice cracked slightly. Whatever it started as, it became real. I care about you. The last 3 weeks have been. I believe you, I said. She blinked. Hadn't expected that. I think somewhere in those 7 months, what started as a game became something genuine for you, I said. I believe that's true. But here's the problem with that. I paused, not for effect, but because I wanted precision. The relationship you fell into genuinely was built on something false. You arrived with a scripted objective. You shaped the early dynamics around a goal that had nothing to do with honest connection. And even when your feelings became real, the patterns you'd established, the managing, the steering, they stayed in place. Because that was the architecture you'd built. You never told me. You never had the conversation that might have changed the foundation. You let it continue on a compromised base and hoped the walls would hold. I was afraid, she said. Once it was real, I was afraid of what you'd do if you knew. And now you know what I do, I said. She shook her head, tears running now. There has to be something worth. After 7 months, there has to be something. Maybe you did fall for me, I said. I'll accept that as true. But you built this on a foundation of deceit. The original intent, the concealment, the patterns that followed. There's nothing real here to salvage. Not because feelings aren't involved, but because I'd always be sitting inside a structure I didn't agree to enter. I can't unknow what I know, and I can't pretend the foundation isn't what it is. She said nothing for a moment. The heater hummed. Inside, the party continued, ambient and warm. I'm sorry, she said. The words were quiet, and I believe they were real. They were too late, which did not make them insincere, only inadequate. I know, I said. I held her gaze for a moment longer, then opened the door and went back inside. I found Patrick in the kitchen, opening his second bottle of something from Graywell Valley that he said had been sitting in his rack for 2 years waiting for the right occasion. I stayed another 30 minutes. I said goodbye to Vance and to Theo. I shook Patrick's hand, told him to send me the details on the collaborative project, and left at 10:15. The drive home took 12 minutes. I had chosen to live in the Selwick area specifically because it was quiet without being isolated, close enough to the office on Holmwood without requiring the kind of traffic that ate into thinking time. I parked, took the stairs, and put the kettle on. I stood at the kitchen counter while the water heated and ran through what had happened with the same clean attention I gave to anything worth examining. The bet, confirmed, not assumed. Origin, a drunk dare between friends, which over time calcified into an operational mode. The target, someone framed as out of reach. The objective, land and control. The result, partial success, followed by actual emotional investment, followed by failure on the control dimension, because the target never capitulated. I made my tea. Earl Grey, no sugar. The control attempts never succeeded. That was worth noting. 7 months of incremental steering, and I had addressed each attempt as it came without anger or capitulation. The relationship had proceeded on reasonably honest terms, except for the one thing it fundamentally lacked, an honest beginning. Did the genuine feeling negate the false origin? No, that was the cleanest possible answer, and it was the correct one. Feelings are not architecture. A building does not become structurally sound because the people inside it love each other. If the load-bearing walls are compromised, the warmth inside is real, but the danger is too. I sat at the kitchen table with my tea. The apartment was quiet. Outside, a car passed. The city settled into its late-night register. I did not feel wounded. I have met people who misread this quality in me as coldness or as emotional unavailability, and they are wrong. I felt what there was to feel about Petra, a measured sadness for something that had contained real moments, genuine conversation, shared laughter on a Wednesday morning when we were both late for work, and neither of us cared. Those things had been real. They did not stop being real because the container that held them had been dishonest. But I'm not a man who rebuilds on bad ground. I have never seen the point. I finished my tea, rinsed the cup, and went to bed. 6 weeks later, Patrick's collaborative project came through. It was a data infrastructure build for a mid-sized property development firm, a 6-month engagement that would require a team of 4 from Veritas and close coordination with Patrick's independent practice. We met at his office on a Thursday afternoon to go through the scope document, his whiteboard filling up with system architecture notes that reminded me, in their structural logic, of conversations about load-bearing design that felt distant now. I thought about Petra once during that meeting, not in grief, more in the way you think about a route you used to take to work before a road closure forced you to find a better one. After the meeting, Patrick and I walked across to a coffee shop called Foundry on the corner of Whitmore Lane that did a genuinely excellent flat white and had the good sense to keep the music at a volume where conversation was still possible. We sat by the window. Outside, the city moved through its afternoon. "I heard you," and Petra ended things. Patrick said, in the way people say things they've known for a while and have been waiting for the right moment to acknowledge. "A while back," I said. "She's good," he said carefully. "I always liked her." "She is," I said, and I meant it. Good people make bad choices. Intelligent people run bad programs. The two are not incompatible. I had no interest in converting Petra into a villain to make my own narrative tidier. She had been many things: sharp, funny, warm in the real moments, compromised in the architecture. All of that could be true at once. "You seem fine," Patrick said, with the slight puzzlement of someone expecting different weather. "I'm fine," I said. He smiled at that and took a drink of his coffee. "The Northport migration," he said. "How'd that land?" "Cleanly," I said. "Exactly as designed." He laughed, and we moved on to the business of the project, the practical matters of system design and timeline, and the specific technical requirements that would define the next 6 months. I pulled out my notebook and began writing down what needed to be done. Outside, the light shifted. The afternoon settled into early evening. The city rearranged itself around its own needs, indifferent and ongoing. I had work to do. I got on with it.
Thanks for listening.